What's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel, and on this episode we are back on the V8 DeLorean project. On this project we went ahead and we did the LS swap, we did the G96 Porsche transmission, we also did all the modifications to the subframe, reinforcement mounts, and got everything pretty much situated, got the engine in there. Now, if you guys haven't seen those episodes, we'll put the link in the description below. So on this episode we're going to be continuing on the project. As you can see, we got the DeLorean completely gutted out. Everything's out of the car, the interior is completely stripped. We got all the wiring out, and Chris is in the process right now of removing the gas tank, as well as the factory brakes and all the factory suspension components, because these cars were horrible from the factory. The wiring was a huge issue too, and that's why we went ahead and went with this American Auto Wire unit. It's a little dusty right now. This car's been living up there for the past month while we got the wide body car ready for SEMA. So we finally got it back down on the ground and we're able to give it the attention it deserves. We also are going to have to replace this roof box, which holds the gull wing doors. I'll probably do a full episode on that shortly, but on this episode, we're gonna just continue on getting this thing stripped down and getting it ready for the new drive line, as well as the braking system that we're gonna be showing on the car. And we're also gonna try to develop some new control arms and a new sway bar setup for the front end to try to bring the car a little more up to date. So enough chit chat, let's get to work. Look at that. Alright, so we got all the suspension out of the car. As you can see, guys, we got the rear coilover out. We got the front suspension on the ground here. How much fun was pulling that out there, Christopher?
A lot of fun.
Yeah, a lot of fun.
Oh, God.
So what we have here is a upper shock perch. So the shock goes inside of this guy right here. The spring sits on this collar, and then it goes up in here. These springs are they're like a Jeep. So they're under so much tension, it's ridiculous. There's two reasons why they did that. One is to just make sure that anyone working on the car will die. And then the second reason is that when you make a spring extra big like this, you're actually adjusting the preload on the spring and the tension in order to give the car a sportier and stiffer ride. But in DeLorean's case, the front end was actually too low when they originally made the car. So in order to go under speed bumps and in order to meet the laws of the 80s, the front end of the car actually had to be higher. So at the last minute, they put these giant springs in the front of the car. Look at a DeLorean next time you actually see one. You'll see that the front end is actually higher than the back. It's like a monster truck. So we're gonna fix that with these KW coilovers real quick. But the next thing I wanna do, now that we've made some good headway tearing out the suspension and the brakes, we're gonna go ahead and take out the factory coolant system, because that's obviously not gonna work for the V8. We're also gonna take out this antiquated AC system, because we're going to be replacing everything in this car with Rustamod air with the latest and greatest. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. Let's get this stuff out of here first. All right, so we got the suspension completely out. Chris has been having so much fun with DeLoreans, haven't you, Chris? Yeah. These lower control arms are for the front here. As you can see, DeLorean definitely skimped on the metal. This is super thin stuff, so we're gonna replace this with something a little bit more substantial. We also went ahead and pulled out the factory AC, so this all went underneath the dashboard right here. We're going to be upgrading all that to Rustamod air, like I said, but also look how much more room for activities we have now that that's gone. And then this is our front rotors, our front brakes. These are going to go bye-bye. We're going to be upgrading these to the Willwood 4-piston units, and we're going to actually making our own kit for the back eventually. Our upper control arms here We're going to be using these for mock-up. We're actually going to be upgrading these eventually with something else, and then we have our shocks. So that brings us to our upgrade of the day. We're going to be running these KW V2 coilovers. Believe it or not, this is a bolt-on kit. I have no idea why they decided to make a bolt-on kit for a DeLorean, but they did. So KW, one of the best coilover manufacturers in my opinion, has this complete bolt-on kit. So this is going to be great for us as far as ride height adjustability, as well as bump and rebound for the shocks. So you have full adjustability up top here. You can adjust how soft or how stiff you want them. Since we're running the 5.3 aluminum LS, it's going to be very similar in weight to the Peugeot, Renault, Volvo, the PRV V6 that came from the factory inside this car. I did test did some measurements as far as the weight goes, and they're pretty much very similar, almost 1-to-1. So in the back here, the chassis looks really good. I'm actually surprised how clean the chassis came out. There is some rust in the front in these corners, but that's normal because the brakes on these cars, the brake boosters, are really prone to leaking most of the time, and that's where you get all this rust in that corner. And this is very interesting. So this is all original. No, there's no support up here for the front of the, this is your bolting point actually for the tub. So this fiberglass tub bolts to the steel chassis up here, and then there's a couple points in the back. But in the middle over here is just completely just swinging in the wind. So we're probably going to delete that spare tire well eventually and then run a big massive aluminum radiator with some ducting. I haven't really completely wrapped my mind around it yet, but I'm thinking it's probably going to aim this direction. And I'm going to use this top surface as like an air duct, and then the bottom will make out of aluminum and then come out into the bay area right there. So we're going to go ahead and mock up these KWs in the rear first, since we know the front we're going to be doing a lot more modifications to the suspension with the sway bar and so on, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But let's go ahead and get these rear coilovers bolted up and then see how they look. So we're on to the next step. We got our coilovers installed. Look at how nice the KW coilovers just go right in this car. So it's pretty simple. You just have a stud on the bottom and a stud going through a flat plate on top. This is so thin. I'm thinking about upgrading the strut tower brace, but for right now I just want to see how everything goes in and everything fits. So the rears are pretty self-explanatory. The front, on the other hand, you can see exactly what we're dealing with. So we got the KW coilover in there. We went ahead and modified the lower control arm. Chris cut off the lower perch for the factory spring. So we have everything nice and clear. Originally, DeLorean had a sway bar plus what's called a traction rod that keeps this lower control arm centered. And it bolts through this hole right here and goes up to a bushing / U-joint here, just like a regular sway bar. But in order to cut costs and to make the system simpler, they doubled the sway bar as a lower control arm extension, similar to what you would see on a lower A-arm. Why they didn't do a full A-arm like this, top and bottom, I have no idea. But this to me looks exactly like something you'd see on an early 90s Nissan 240SX. So our plan is to source lower control arms from an early 90s 240SX. We're going to modify the points where the suspension actually bolts to, modify it where the spindle bolts to, and modify it where the bolt goes through. From there, we're going to use the 240SX lower control arm design with what they call as a TC rod. And the TC rod comes from the bottom of the control arm forward and mounts to the chassis. Getting rid of this horrible design that DeLorean came up with the original lower sway bar A-arm design. Because what happens with that is when the sway bar comes up and down, this control arm actually rocks in and rocks out. So under load and cornering, this thing is completely changing its caster as you're driving the car, and it makes it a horrible road feel, and you can't dial it in the way you want to. But the first thing we're going to do before we do all that is we're going to get rid of these brake lines, because we're going to be putting a sway bar through here, and we're also going to be reinforcing our strut towers. In order to do that, I'm going to get rid of the spare tire to make room for our strut tower brace. Now our strut tower brace is just going to be this simple piece of moly. Nice lightweight chromoly. We're then going to take that piece of moly, weld it across, and then we're going to triangulate it in the center. That's going to stop this strut tower and that strut tower from folding in on itself under heavy cornering. This is a massive weak point in the chassis, and we're just going to do our best to try to improve on what they have. Alright guys, we got our support brace in, aka strut tower brace. The backside still needs some more welding, and we still need to get some more on the underside of the pipe. But since we're going to go ahead and get this chassis completely repowder coated, we'll go ahead and do that once we pull the body off the car. As you can see, this thing is solid in there. It's going to stop these strut towers from flexing like I said before, and this center brace is really going to tie it in. Ideally you want 3 points on a strut tower. That's why on some cars they have these additional braces that go to the firewall. Well, that's not a firewall. It's just a fiberglass piece of nothing that separates you from the outside world. So with a body on frame design like this, we have to tie back into the chassis. So this is our best support that we can come up with. Next up on the docket for reinforcing the front of this car is I'm gonna throw some 1/4-inch gussets in the corners of the chassis over there and here. Throw a gusset in just like that, just to give this corner some extra strength, to be able to handle some of the lateral load of it going this way. Ideally, I know we should be building a complete chassis, but that's just not in the budget for this build. So we're gonna be working with what we have and just trying to create like an OEM plus for this car, for this build, compared to the wide body one that was completely radical and just a straight show car. This is gonna be more performance oriented and more driver centered. So we're gonna go ahead and weld those in right now, see how they look. All right guys, so we got our gussets welded in, and they're not like the craziest thing you ever seen. Like, it's not like this huge gusset, but it's going to be able to give us a little bit more strength in that corner. You'd be surprised how much adding little pieces like that to a factory chassis makes a big difference, especially with torsional load and with chassis flex. So I'm really confident that these little modifications that we've made are going to make a huge difference on this car. Now, just to recap, we went ahead and we threw our KW variant V2s on the back with not too many modifications. As you can see, it's just a direct bolt on. I'm still thinking about doing an adjustable rear lower control arm, just so we can dial in the camber, and also this upper here. There's a company that actually sells adjustable upper and lower. And then this guy, this giant trailing arm looking thing, like it's almost like a truck arm suspension in a NASCAR. I might actually make that adjustable too, just so we can really dial in the settings on the suspension, but that'll be in a later episode. For right now, we got our back end all dialed in. The front is all situated. We went ahead and mocked up the factory lower control arm, and we put in the steering rack, which we're actually gonna upgrade that to a Flaming River unit. Our V2 is mounted inside there with our factory upper control arm, which we'll probably be updating a little bit later. But this is a good base point to know exactly where this suspension system needs to be in space in order to upgrade our lower control arms and sway bar setup that I was talking about before. So we got our gusset bar in as well, this big old strut tower brace. I'm really interested to see how this is going to make a big difference on the car. Not sure if I mentioned in previous episodes about this car, is that this is a one owner car. This is actually like a family heirloom to a really cool family, really cool guy that I found down in Boca, and thinking about letting him drive it. I think he's 90 years old actually, so I might actually just take him for a ride in it. But hit up the comment section below how cool you think that would be to actually take him for a ride in his old DeLorean that he loved so much after we do all these modifications to it. So anyway guys, we're gonna put a button on the end of this episode. Next episode, we're going to be continuing on the front suspension. We're gonna be doing lower control arm modifications as well as our remote sway bar. And we're going to be working on how we can get more traction out of the front end of the car without having all that camber and caster gain that is plaguing the original design of this setup. So thanks a lot for watching. Thanks for subscribing. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you guys on the next episode. Peace.